Hello, I'm Lynn Kronberger, the Chief Development Officer here at WAMU. We are thrilled that you could join us today as Diane and her panel discuss The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Published in 1963, The Fire Next Time was a national bestseller as well as a voice for the emerging civil rights movement. Many of you are still spending a lot of time at home, and WAMU is continuing to produce virtual events like this to keep you company. Our mission is to connect listeners and members around the world and to each other, and we think events like this does just that. You know, public media is all about the public, and that's what is important to us. It's also our largest source of funding is the public. And so for people who can step up and support us right now, we'd ask you to consider making a donation to DianeRehm.org. I'm sorry, DianeRehm.org. That's not right. Let me just look at it. DianeRehm.org. Oh, I forgot the /give. It's DianeRehm.org/give. Those that can and are able to step up, please do so and help us keep events like this on the air. We are grateful to the over 1,200 people that are joining us today that have registered. That's an amazing number of people. And we have closed captioning available at the bottom of the screen. Just press your button there, and we are recording this and streaming this live. So I'd now like to introduce to you our wonderful host, Diane Rehm.
And thank you, Lynn, for that, and welcome everybody to the September virtual book club. And as Lynn said, our book today, James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. It was published in 1963. However, at this point, it is back on the bestseller list. So I think that says a great deal about James Baldwin's book. So many of you logging in from not only around the country, but around the world. We've got listeners who've joined us from as far as Brazil, Finland, Oman, India, Japan, and Turkey. So quite a wonderful international audience that we're very pleased to have with us. Baldwin's book, of course, explores the failure of white America to confront its history of racial oppression and asks whether reckoning is possible. So today, joining me for a discussion of this book and those issues, Eddie Glaude. He's chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. Welcome, Eddie. Good to have you.
Pleasure.
Jeanne Theoharis is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of City University of New York and author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. And finally, Clint Smith, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of the forthcoming book, How the Word is Passed. And throughout this hour, we we'll be taking your questions as well. It's meant to be a worldwide discussion. So if you'd like to join us with your own question, you can type them in at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to just as many as we can. Well, welcome to all of you. I'm so glad to have you with us for a discussion of this really great book. I confess it is the first time I have read this book. A long time coming, but so important, and so important especially now. Eddie, there is a passage that you feel really sets the tone of the book on page 5. Would you read that for us and explain why you think it's so important?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm so delighted to be a part of this conversation, but let's just jump into the text. And I know, which is much worse, and this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. One can be, indeed, one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, for this is what most of mankind has been best at since we've heard of man. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind. But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime.
Tell us why you believe that is such an important passage.
Well, I think there are so many features of this important book. Baldwin grapples with the question of identity. He's going to grapple with the question of agency, but he's also grappling with the issue of history. How the nation in so many ways refuses to confront what it has done, that it seeks safety and comfort in its myths and illusions. It allows itself to believe that it is the shining city on the hill, or the Redeemer nation, or an example of democracy achieved. And it does so by denying what it has wrought, right? And what it continues to do. And so in so many ways, the book is about an unflinching demand that the country finally grow up. And for Baldwin, the end of innocence is actually the definition of freedom. Because freedom is a kind of maturity that evidences itself in one's willingness to risk, to jump into the fray, to confront one's fallenness, as it were. As he once put it, in order to reach for wisdom, you got to leave youth behind, right? You got to, and so this is part of that formulation. The innocence is the crime. You can't be willfully ignorant about what you've done.
And Jeanne, what's fascinating here is that the first portion of the book is a letter to his nephew, his brother's son. Talk about that relationship between Baldwin and his nephew and why he felt it was important to structure the book that way. The second half truly talks about Baldwin's own thinking, his own thoughts about America and racial injustice.
Well, it's great to be here, and it's an honor to be here with Eddie and Clint and you, Diane, so thank you. I think he's asking the nation, right, to grow up, like Eddie's saying. But there's also a way that he's, particularly in the first chapter, right, talking to his nephew, there's an element of like helping his nephew to kind of see clearly, and also not to take these messages kind of into himself, right? Which I think is part of the theme, because part of the danger of the myths that we tell, right, are the ways that we take them into ourselves. And there are different kinds of dangers, right? And Baldwin is going to identify some of the dangers for his nephew. And one of the things I want to point to, and this is on the next, so Eddie was reading on the bottom of 5 and top of 6, but I want to point us to the next page, the bottom of 7, where he's saying, you were born into a society spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you are a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. Wherever you have turned, James, in your short time on this earth, you have been told where you could go and what you could do and how you could do it, and where you could live and whom you could marry. I know your countrymen do not agree with me about this, and I hear them saying, you exaggerate. And then this is the sentence I want us to hear. They do not know Harlem, and I do. Because I think the second thing very much kind of Baldwin is asking us to see is this is not a Southern problem. This is a national problem. And running through this book, right, is the ways that he is holding up Northerners and Northern liberalism to account too, right? Because I think sometimes when we read texts, and particularly when we read texts from 1963, we think about Mississippi, we think about Birmingham, we think about Montgomery. And I think Baldwin there, he's talking to his nephew, right? And he's saying, people are going to say you exaggerate, right? When you say you were told where you could go, what you could be, how you could live. But we know Harlem, and in effect, we know New York City, right? So this paragon, in some sense, of American liberalism is also, right, has this core problem too, right? And so I think Baldwin throughout this whole book, and again, he's first talking to his nephew to say, don't take this into yourself, because they're gonna, again, to use the word of the day, they're gonna gaslight you. They're gonna say this is not happening to you here in New York.
They are defining you. Do not let them define you. Mm-hmm. And Clint, you too had a passage that stood out to you.
Yeah, I mean, there are several. And just to speak briefly, to the point that was made beforehand, I think part of what Baldwin is doing is doing a sort of balancing act that many Black parents or the people who love Black children, whether it be a parent, whether it be a pastor, whether it be a teacher, whether it be an aunt, an uncle, family by blood or by choice, this idea that the necessity of conveying the realities of the world to a young Black child so that they are prepared to navigate a world that seeks to define them before they have the opportunity to define themselves, while also not allowing them to become subsumed in a sort of despair, or to become overwhelmed with the notion, or to misconstrue the idea that the realities that they are experiencing, in this context, the reality that James is experiencing in Harlem in 1963, is somehow the result of something James has done, or something that is the result of what James' father has done, or what his father has done. And we have to remind ourselves that we're reading this book, or James Baldwin is writing this book less than a century after slavery has ended, right? Like, it is only a few decades before that the final, that the people who lived through enslavement themselves had passed away, right? So this is very much the people who James is writing in a moment where people still loved and hugged and kissed and had relationships with people who had been born into bondage. And in the idea that he lived in a country that would suggest that that period of time had no relevance to the current, at that moment, the contemporary landscape of inequality, or the reason that Harlem looked the way that it did, was absurd to him, right? And he's writing, it's interesting to read this in the sort of amid the larger constellation of Baldwin's work. As an educator, I taught high school English for several years before I became a writer. I think often about his essay, A Talk to Teachers, which was a speech he had given to a group of educators. And I think so, and in it, you know, so many of these themes come up again and again and again, but in it, he is saying you have a responsibility to communicate to these young people that the reason their communities look the way that they do is not because of the people in those communities, but it's because what has been done to these communities generation after generation after generation after generation. And instilling that it instills a sense of liberate, like it can be a liberating or an emancipatory feeling for a young person, because they've been told their entire lives that there's something wrong with them, but in fact there's something wrong with the country that has done these things to them.
And let's talk for a moment about what was going on in the country in 1963 when Baldwin wrote this book. I mean, there was so much upheaval going on even in those times, Jeanne.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I'm gonna be like a one-note wonder today, but I'm gonna stick with talking about New York. In part because I think sometimes when we think about 1963, we think the March on Washington. And I think going back to Clint's point about kind of Baldwin thinking about education, thinking about teachers, right? We are in the midst in New York City in 1963 in a massive movement to try to get the Board of Ed in New York City to even make a plan, right, to comprehensively desegregate New York City schools. And people we associate more with the South, right? Kenneth Clark, Ella Baker, right? They're on the front lines of this. And then other New Yorkers as well, May Mallory, Milton Glamison, right? The next year, the biggest demonstration in the history of the civil rights movement. We're not talking about the March on Washington. We're talking about February 1st, 1964, nearly 500,000 students and teachers stay out of New York City schools because there is no comprehensive plan for desegregation in the city. So when Baldwin writes to his nephew, right, he's writing to his nephew in Harlem in the midst of an incredibly segregated school system that's constantly saying we're not segregated.
Huh.
In fact, the superintendent of New York City schools says, in fact, it instructs his administrators, don't say the word segregation, don't use that word, use separation, right? And over and over and over, you're gonna see New York City constantly be like, we're not responsible for the problem, we don't have a problem, all of this. And so part of that message that he's trying to bring home to his nephew, right, is because there are so many messages in the city at that moment saying the problem with Black schools is Black kids, it's Black parents, right? That's one of the ways that New York City administrators are trying to kind of shift the blame of the problem. We don't have to desegregate, the problem is culture, the problem is values. And so when we think about 1963, I would ask us to think about a kind of a growing mass movement in New York City, along with a growing mass movement. Again, we typically think about Birmingham in 63, across the country, right? Basically saying there can be no more business as usual.
And Eddie, what was actually going on in Baldwin's own life in that period in 63? Your microphone is...
Baldwin's on the verge of becoming James Baldwin, right? I mean, he is at the height of his powers in this moment. And he's made his way from Paris. He's done something that is just striking, startling, right? He's born August of 1924 in Harlem, not in Sugar Hill, right? But in Harlem, right? Post-Depression Harlem, not pre-Depression Harlem, right? He's born in this moment where this is a resource-deprived community, and he wills himself into becoming the writer that can reflect the stories in his head. He goes to Paris in 1948. He returns initially in order to sell his novel and his play and the like. He goes back, realizes that he wants to become a part of this movement, and becomes in some ways a witness, right? And bears witness. And Fire Next Time, right, for some people represents the culmination of his powers during this period, right? He's also, he's become a part of the movement right? You know, David Lemming says he joins CORE in SNCC. I'm not sure about that, but he becomes a critical member of SNCC. He actually participates in an action in Selma, right? But let me just say this too really quickly, Diane. Jeanne talks about the strike, but just 1 year later, 15-year-old kid is killed by police.
Yeah.
Harlem explodes.
Yeah.
Medgar is killed, right? The year before, in '63, right? The Birmingham September bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. Baldwin is writing in this moment of extraordinary transition, right? And remember, a year later, '64, you're going to get Blues for Mr. Charlie, which is a very different kind of work that kind of foreshadows the direction he's going. So this is a really important book. He's at the height of his powers, but it's also, it reflects in some ways the trajectory of his work in my view.
I want to know how he gets there. I want to know a little more about his own early life. I want to know about his parents, how he was raised, what they believed in, and what church became such a huge part of his life, which he writes about in the second portion of this book. But talk about that 14-year-old James Baldwin and what was going on in his life that led him to write this book that many years later. Eddie?
Well, you know, look, he's the oldest of 9, a stepfather who is, and a mother who are both part of this wave of Black folk who are moving out of the South as a result of the violence of the region, as well as the kind of the boll weevil, the boll weevil attack on crops, the push and pull, as it were, of these forces. Burtis comes out of Eastern Shore. Dad is from Louisiana, or stepfather, that is, who had a very difficult time raising his children, providing for them. Baldwin bore the brunt of his stepfather's rage. In so many ways, there's not only physical abuse, I think there's not only physical abuse, but mental abuse there. And in some ways, Baldwin's turn to the pulpit is a way to checkmate his father, as he writes, or his stepfather, right? That he could not be bothered because he was in the room preparing his sermons, right? In Fire Next Time, he actually represents the turn to the church as his gimmick, right? As his way of protecting himself, as he's coming to understand his own body, his own sense of desire, right? As well as the world that is ominous and menacing him and others, right? So he comes out of an environment that would not suggest that he would become one of the greatest writers the world has ever seen. That's just a quick biography. DeWitt High School, didn't go to college. We could,
he
Greenwich Village, Paris. I'm sorry, Diane.
Out of high school, or just he dropped out, or he just didn't go to high school at all, Jeanne? Your microphone is not on. Would you?
Eddie, why don't you finish up? Like you were saying about his high school and college. Why don't you finish?
Oh no, he went to high school. He went to DeWitt Clinton, and he was brilliant in his own way. Wasn't very good in terms of grades, but edited the local newspaper, wrote some really interesting pieces as a young man. He did not go to college, right? This is really important. Just like Richard Wright didn't go to college, right? We can just tell a story about this kind of genius that emerges in unsuspected places. In so many ways, Baldwin's class formation is absolutely key to understanding his voice. He's urban, he's Pentecostal, he's poor, right? His education happens, right? As he moves out of DeWitt, he finds himself in Greenwich, right? And he finds himself moving among circles, the New York intellectuals, provide him with this space to grow as an intellect. He's reviewing books as a young man and the like, right? So he's in a space that gives him opportunity to nurture his genius, but he realizes very early on that the hatred he saw in his father, and he only knew him as his father, he's his stepfather, but he only knew him as his father.
Yeah.
What he saw consuming his father was beginning to consume him. And he said later on, if he didn't leave the United States in 1948, either he was going to be killed or he was going to kill somebody.
Well, it was fascinating to me. Two sentences I want to put before you. One on page 16. I've got my little dog in my lap. She wants to say hi to everybody.
Hi!
She
I should
usually
get
does
mine. I
want
should
to
let
say
my
hi
baby
to
out.
everybody when they're on Zoom. So there we are. So on page 16, he says, I suppose that God and safety were synonymous. The word safety brings us to the real meaning of the word religious as we use it. And then again, in the letter to his nephew, he says to him, some went on wine or whiskey or the needle and are still on it. Others, like me, fell into the church. So the church becomes enormously important to him. And I wonder, was it exactly as Eddie says, somehow a way to challenge his father for power, for control? Or did he deeply believe, Clint?
Yeah, my sense of it is that the two aren't mutually exclusive necessarily, right? I think that it was certainly a way, as Eddie pointed out, for him to, as he says pretty explicitly, he says for him to sort of reassert a sort of control in a scenario, in a set of conditions in which he felt so little control, right? Both so little control in the context of his own home, in the sort of abuse he experienced there, but also, as we can tell in the book, the sort of larger lack of control that young Black people coming up in this moment are feeling, right? Where he's saying, there were you could either be a prize fighter, or you can try to dance, or you could try to sing, or there felt like there were so few means of escape for young Black people in this moment, that, and Baldwin does a sort of move where he a sort of meta-analysis of himself in the text, where he recognizes, I think in the textbook, and also in that moment, he's like, well, I'm not gonna be a prize fighter. I can't sing, I can't dance. I don't want to be a junkie. The place that I can find some sort of sanctuary and some type of escape, escape is this sort of theme that that is a sort of central piece of this text moving throughout it. And obviously escape is going to be this idea that sort of is a central fixture of his life in many ways, immigration and emigration, and escape both emotionally and escape physically. And so I think the church is, part of what young people do is they explore and they try to figure out who they are, and they play, they play different sports, they play different musical instruments, or they do they explore in all sorts of ways, some good and some bad. But I think this is a means of exerting control, but also a means of escaping and exploring the different parts of himself. And I think what is clear is that those years for Baldwin as someone who was writing sermons and someone who began to see I'm not sure exactly how he expresses it in the text, but that he almost has a sense that he is thus, as a young pastor, able to have some sense of control over the congregation, right? He recognizes the power of his sermons to move and to shape the way that the people in the congregation are, the way that they think, the way that they navigate the world, the way that how they are in that moment. And I think we see so much of that in his writing, where I don't know that we would. It feels almost certain that we wouldn't have the same Baldwin that we do for so many years had he not had those formative years as functionally a writer and a performer. in the church when he was a teenager.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. Jeanne, what do you think about the fact that the pastor who recruited him, as well as the people on the street, kept asking the same question: whose little boy are you? The crossover between the world outside and the world inside is really rather striking there.
Right. Yeah, no. And to kind of build on what Clint was just saying, to me, one of the things that I think the church gives him is the ability to kind of use a moral language, right? It's like, how do you make sense? How do you speak about what is happening in a way, both like to other Black people, right? But that I think also the church and the language of morality, and again, I would argue that Baldwin has a kind of moral language about history too, like that, that you can see running through a lot of his writings, right? That it gives him a way to, if we're kind of, where we began our conversation today was the ways that Baldwin is calling America to account, right? And I think there's no way to read that language, like, and the power of that language separate from where Baldwin begins, which is a young pastor, right? That like, that the way that he marshals that argument, the way that you understand as a pastor that part of your responsibility is to get people to see themselves, and whether it's literally that congregation where he begins, but to me, there's a kind of pastoral language that then he moves into the public sphere with. That's again about, again, if we're going to really get into the weeds, right? Like the kind of that part of Matthew, right? Where Matthew, like where it's, you have to look at yourself before you can talk about the splinter in somebody else's eye. And so in some sense, we're going to see that moral language. Baldwin is going to move that into the public sphere and talk about that America has to do that, right? That America has to look at itself,
but
right? That we are not the city on the hill. Right?
At the same time, he criticizes religion
absolutely.
Over and over again. And then, as one of our listeners says, he ends eloquently with a slave spiritual that references the Bible. Can the panelists comment on that seeming contradiction?
Oh, it's not a contradiction. Baldwin says he left the church, but the church never left him.
Right.
So he's shaped by the languages of the King James Bible. He's shaped by, his sentences are Henry James-esque. He's reading Proust. His bibliography is long. So it takes a stern discipline to read him. So it's not a contradiction at all. Remember, you read the key passage, right? He talks about the danger of safety, right? That God and safety were synonymous.
Yeah.
There's a way in which William James, in the variety of religious experience, will say and in his other writings, he will say at the heart of religion is the cry for help, 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 right? And so what is his answer? The answer can be the illusion of safety. What is safety, right? Being secure from the dangers, the environment that menaces one, right? So then you look at the passage on page 24. Because he's born in 1924. This is in some ways, the second part of the essay, Dawn of the Cross, is a Bildungsroman. It's a coming of age story in part. It's paralleled with the birthday that he's writing to his son, to his nephew, Big James, his namesake, right? But what does he say? So he's born in 1924. By the time he's 14, it's post-depression, Harlem, right? So he says, every Negro boy in my situation during those years at least who reaches this point, right? The point where he has to make a choice, she has to make a choice, realizes at once profoundly, because he wants to live, that he stands in great peril and must find with speed a thing, a gimmick, to lift him out, to start him on his way. And it does not matter what the gimmick is. It was this last realization that terrified me. And since it revealed that the door opened on so many dangers, given that, effeminate young boy, the object of a certain kind of predatory behavior, right? Helped hurl me into the church safety. And by an unforeseeable paradox, it was my career in the church that turned out precisely to be my gimmick, right? His sense of safety. So then he realizes, because he's behind the curtain, Diane, what a certain understanding of Christianity, shaped by a world organized along the lines of a certain set of lies about Black people and white people, how it even gets reproduced within a certain kind of Black Christian imaginary.
But then he says, on page 45, he says, in the realm of power, Christianity has operated with an unmitigated arrogance and cruelty. So he is angry with the church as much as he is formed by it and feels filled by it. He is angry with the church. And one has to wonder about these forces pulling him in separate directions, Clint.
Yeah, and I think, I think about this two ways. On one hand, I think the church, his recognition of what the church has afforded him and provided him with, sits alongside a disillusionment with the way that the church has been used to justify the social conditions certain people live in, to justify the abuse that he experiences, or this is also a time when he is, wrestling and figuring out he's coming of age. He's wrestling with his own sexuality. And so the church is telling him certain things about himself that he is, as many young people who are part of the LGBTQ community who are coming up in spaces that worse than don't legitimate it, but speak crudely and harmfully about what that identity represents and what it means. So I think that the church is in some ways a microcosm of that tension that he feels for the country, in which it is a place that, the off quoted line, I'm paraphrasing, where he's like, I love America so much, and that is why I have the right to, and I must criticize it so it can live up to the promise that it kept. And I think, the church is a place that at once provided him sanctuary, and then on the other hand, probably made him feel small.
And then if we can, let's move on to talk about his relationship to the Nation of Islam and his introduction to Elijah Muhammad, which seemed strained, to say the very least. Jeanne.
Yeah, but I think there's an interesting thing he's doing with the Nation of Islam. And I guess when I was rereading this past few weeks, right, and thinking about what's the parallel to today, like what would he want us to take on this? Because I think there's a way we could read this part on the Nation of Islam, and it just feels separate from us today. And I think part of what Baldwin is asking us here is to confront a kind of Black anger, a kind of Black unwillingness to play by a kind of liberal assimilationist rules, right? And obviously he's wrestling with the nation, and he's wrestling with Elijah Muhammad, but he's also making the reader have to sit with them. And he's asking us, I think, to have to sit with why we're so, and particularly, I think, the ways we might not want to sit with them. And he's wrestling with that on a personal level, but I also think the text is wrestling with that on a larger level. And I think what it asks of us today in 2020 is to wrestle with a similar kind of, what I see being a kind of nervousness in American culture today, when you start to see a kind of Black anger, a kind of unwillingness to you know, and I think we see this in terms of various criticisms of Black Lives Matter, right? Where it's like, why are they so angry? You're not going about it right way. And that, so to me, part of the Nation of Islam, part of this book is Baldwin asking the reader to have to sort of confront that anger differently.
He says, we were offered as Nation of Islam doctrine historical and divine proof that all white people are cursed and are devils and are about to be brought down. Very little time, he writes, was spent on theology, for one did not need to prove to a Harlem audience that all white men were devils. So then he goes and visits, or tries to visit, with Elijah Muhammad. What happens, Eddie? It seems like a very strange encounter.
Well, you know, it's also a duplication of the question, whose little boy are you? Right? You can only answer that question once, he says. So there's the search for the father figure that Elijah Muhammad represents in that moment. It's also, we need to be clear too, is that he's also rendering the Nation of Islam intelligible, that it's not wholly other, right? So the thing when he lists the theology about Allah creating, white, the scientist, big-headed scientist Yaqub creating the white folks on the island of Patmos and da-da-da-da, he lays it out, but then he says on page 67, he translates that. He says, by definition, there's no virtue in white people. And then he goes, there's nothing new in this merciless formulation, except the explicitness of its symbols and the candor of its hatred. Its emotional tone is as familiar to me as my own skin. It is but another way of saying that sinners shall be bound in hell 1,000 years. That those sinners, so what he's doing in that moment, he's engaging in translation, right? You're trying to show how the Nation of Islam makes sense, given the circumstances of Black life. Even he goes on page 69, that sentence, he says, for the horrors of the American Negro's life, there has been almost no language. The privacy of his experience, which is only beginning to be recognized in language and which is denied or ignored in official or popular speech, hence the Negro idiom, lends credibility to any system that pretends to clarify it. So we have to understand the nation as growing organically out of the American contradiction. And we have to understand it in relation to the horror of Elijah Muhammad's life. He saw lynchings as a young boy. He saw the cruelty and barbarity of the South in Georgia. And that cruelty and barbarity lingered and colored his eyes.
So James Baldwin, is also asking us to think about America and its place in the world. And how does he see America in this world? Clint.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a passage where he says, this is, I think I have a different version. I'm moving between my ebook and my physical. But it's toward the end. It begins the paragraph, the American Negro has the great advantage.
Page 101.
101. Look at Eddie. Know this from the top. That's why we got
He knows it.
101. The American Negro has the great advantage of having never believed that collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible to battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all other neighbors or inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile, and American women are pure. Negroes know far more about white Americans than that. And I think about that a lot because I remember when I first read it, I think there are two ways of reading it. I think I read it and I said, it felt at odds with some of his other writing, especially if we're thinking about A Talk to Teachers, because I was like, well, part of the problem is that so many young Black people don't know so much of the history that has shaped the contemporary landscape of their community. And it seems as if in his other writing, he is trying to convey part of why some Black people and so many white people fall into this sense that the conditions of their communities are these inevitabilities, is because no one has taught them all of the things that have been done to them to make this a reality. But then on a different reading of it, I think part of it is, and this is in conversation with some piece earlier where he's talking about how you walk through Harlem and all of the folks standing on the soapboxes, the Muslim Brothers or others, are talking about the man. And like the white man did this, the man did that, the man did that. And part of what Baldwin, I think, is trying to do is to bring these things together and to say, Black people have an acute sense that this did not just happen, or that this is not just the result of something we have done wrong, even if there's not necessarily the historical citations or the sociological evidence or the empirical evidence or the sort of toolkit with which to brandish at any moment, to make, to explain the history of redlining, to explain the history of the economics of and capitalism of slavery, but that folks know. And I think about my own grandparents, right? I think about my own, the way that I was taught at my kitchen table was like, it was the man, even though there was not necessarily the language to name specifically what these forces were. There was a recognition that there were larger forces that were shaping what communities look like, that were shaping what Black communities look like. And I think part of what Baldwin is trying to do in his sort of larger canon of work, if you will, is to communicate again this idea that so much of what this country has told you, white America, is a lie. And it is up to you to understand. He says in The Fire Next Time, he's like, this is not a problem that Black Americans need to solve. This is a problem that white Americans need to solve. There is a myth that white America has been told about itself. And it is up to white America to reckon with and to unlearn the mythology about itself in order to build the sort of world that the founding fathers ostensibly were seeking to create. Because the story that you tell about the founding fathers right now is one that, strips them of any sort of complexity and contradictions that we clearly know embodied so much of who they were.
So, Jeanne, how is this book reaching the people it needs to reach today? His message, how is that getting across today?
Well, I guess what I would say would be that this book has to be a beginning. And we were talking at the beginning, right, about how this is back on the bestseller list, and that's very exciting, right? And I think people are turning to reading for, to kind of, and to Baldwin, I think, because we need to be confronting this, and in some sense, this place where we started our conversation today about innocence, right? And the feign of innocence, right? That Baldwin is constantly asking us as Americans to like take that, to get beyond the ways we want to see ourselves, to see the way we are, right? Which I think is a theme that runs through the book. To me, what this book asks of us, right, is that it's a beginning. It has to be a beginning, right? Because to go back to what Clint was just saying, like part of what Baldwin is saying here and is saying in many of his other writings is that we have not confronted our history in a serious way, right? And we have to learn our history in a serious way.
And
right? So that this book have to be I think to me, what he asks of us is, right, not just to like be like, whoa, I read James Baldwin, I did something, right? But that the book asks us to go farther, right? It asks us to sort of say, okay, what it means to read James Baldwin is that I need to then really learn a different history, learn a fuller history. I need to really grapple with this in a new way, right? That the book is a beginning, I think.
And one of our listeners says, almost 5 decades since the publication of The Fire Next Time, white and racial superiority are even more synonymous identities for many. It permeates our culture and politics at every level. Is there any realistic hope of achieving a fair America for all?
You know, there's a wonderful line in Baldwin's 1972 book, No Name in the Street. And I'll paraphrase here. He describes human beings as both miracles and disasters, that we have to protect ourselves from the disasters that we've become. And he's saying this on the heels of the assassination of Dr. King. They've killed the apostle of love, right? Now, in saying that, it is a deeply realistic assessment of who we are as human beings and what we've done. But it's also an insistence that if we show up, we have a chance, right? Because there is the possibility of a miracle, because we're not only disasters, we are miraculous. And he has the example of the tradition out of which he comes. He describes those young children as improbable aristocrats in The Fire Next Time. Those folk who came out of the, out of the cruelty and barbarity of Mississippi, risked everything, right? Exhibited a kind of courage that you don't need to go back to, the early Christianity to find, exemplars of a certain kind of witness, right? And so Baldwin wants to say in that moment, if we, show up, we at least have a chance, but there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee, though.
So, Eddie, you recently wrote a book about Baldwin and yourself that focuses on his later work, No Name in the Street. So how does Baldwin evolve between those two books?
He has to reckon with our dead. He has to reckon with the country's betrayal. So 63, that, March on Washington, this is the height. 64, passage of the Civil Rights Act, 65, passage of the Voting Rights Act, right? Medgar's dead in 63. Malcolm's dead in 65. King is dead in 68. But on top of that, he's watching these young people who risked everything in the bowels of the South, who experienced terror, raw terror, not only in the South, but in the North, in the Midwest, in the West, right? And he sees their eyes darken and he hears them cry Black power, right? And to my mind, Black power constitutes the repressed of contemporary American politics. We don't want to deal with it in interesting sorts of ways. And Baldwin's refusal to cast those young people away. He never turns his back on them. He instead bears witness to a period where his anger, his rage, his disappointment, the country's betrayal are all in full view. And so if we want to pull that thread to our contemporary moment, Diane, part of why I wrote the book is because I looked around and I said to myself, I'll be damned, white folks have done it again. And here we are, my baby has to risk his life to go out and protest police killing us while a global pandemic is killing us at 2.5 times the rate of other people. I'll be damned. So I had to find some resources, and I turned to Jimmy, who's been there, and who wrote his way through it. So that's why I did.
So
Everybody buy Eddie's book.
Oh, Clint,
begin again. You've got it. So,
thank you, man.
Jeanne, going back to what was said early, certainly it's been a time for introspection for many, many white people, Americans asking themselves what they can or should do. So, what is Baldwin's answer?
Well, again, I think one of the things that we have to do is to confront history in a kind of a much, much more serious way, right? Going back to Clint, like I love a talk to teachers too. That's sort of where I began with Baldwin. And in fact, I took one of the sentences for my last book, but it's one of my favorite sentences where he writes, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that offers us a way forward, right? Like, it's not just about like, we're going to just like walk on, like burning coals, right? Like it gives us both a much more sober view of ourselves as Americans, but also a much more inspiring, much more beautiful. And I think that's one place to start, is that it like is a real reckoning with history, not, I think a second place to start is thinking about the ways that the kinds of deflections and the ways that Baldwin's asking us to get past those deflections. And the place I obviously began today was about the way that we cast racism in the form of the South or in the form of certain kinds of hateful actions. And I think Baldwin is asking us to look at structures, right? That racism is not just about hate, but about power. It's about hoarding. It's about structure. And so I think,
we're almost out of time, but I don't want to leave without that last line. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. What's he telling us, Clint?
And, I think there are a couple different ways to read that. But when I read that line, what I think of is how remarkable it is that Black Americans have experienced all that we have through 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, Reconstruction being destroyed, Black codes, Jim Crow apartheid, mass criminalization, mass incarceration, redlining, housing sector. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think about how remarkable it is that Black people have achieved in spite of all of that.
Indeed.
All of what this community has done. That it is and that so much culture has been created in spite of that so much richness of life, that so much joy and celebration still exists despite it. And I think also how remarkable it is that Black people have largely, there's a different word for it, but peacefully transitioned from what was an apartheid state, a slave state, and then an apartheid state.
And we're going to have to.
And have not done something more than we have done.
Clint Smith, thank you so much. Jeanne Theoharis, Eddie Glaude. It was just wonderful to talk with you and to hear all your insights. And to our audience, before you go, please take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event. It's going to pop up on your screen. And if you would, consider donating to WAMU. Your financial support is so important to us. Our next meeting of my book club will be on Wednesday, October 28th, and we'll be reading George Orwell's 1984. I hope you can join us. Stay safe, stay well. Thank you for being with us. I'm Diane Rehm.